Welcome to this explainer. Look, we're just going to jump right in today. We are exploring the invisible scaffolding of our entire modern world, the global debt system. We hear about national debt all the time in the news, right? But we rarely stop to think about the actual mechanics behind it. How does the whole thing actually work?
Well, think about this for a second. If literally every country on Earth is in debt, who exactly is the creditor? It's a totally mind-bending paradox, isn't it? If everybody owes money, who is actually owed the money? We're going to unravel this together today by following the chain of global creditors right to its surprising source. And trust me, nothing here is as simple as it looks. Just consider the sheer scale of the situation for a minute. The staggering sums owed by major global powers right now are almost difficult to wrap your head around. The United States is sitting at $38 trillion, the European Union carries around $14 trillion, and Japan is at nearly $9 trillion. I mean, even massive export powerhouses owe enormous sums. But as massive as these numbers are, they're honestly just the tip of the iceberg.
Because when you zoom out to the whole planet, the world is currently drowning in a total global debt of $315 trillion. Just let that massive number sink in. $315 trillion. That is nearly 3 times the size of the entire global economy. Every war, every crisis, every economic boom and bust, it all sits right on top of this giant mountain of IOUs.
So, how exactly did we get here? Let's look at the birth of bonds, from the battlefield to the balance sheet.
To understand how we reached this point, we actually need to rewind all the way to the year 1694. England was fighting France and rapidly running out of gold, so the king turned to merchants for help. In exchange for a permanent stream of interest payments backed by future taxes, they financed the crown. And to manage this entirely new arrangement, the Bank of England was created. This was an absolute game changer. The state could now spend money it didn't even have yet while giving lenders a priceless tradable promise. Just like that, the modern government bond was born.
This shift literally changed global power dynamics forever. Empires once conquered territory to extract gold. Now they issued bonds to extract interest. The battlefield became the balance sheet. I absolutely love this quote because it hits the nail on the head. It captures exactly how the ability to borrow became the ultimate measure of a nation's credibility and its ability to rule. National debt became a feature of power, not a mark of failure.
All right, which brings us to our next major question. Who holds the bag? Let's uncover the global creditor.
Fast forward 3 centuries to today, and we have to ask who actually holds the other end of the rope. Starting with the biggest player, the United States. The reality behind that $38 trillion US debt is actually super surprising. Roughly 2/3 of it, 66%, is essentially a circular mirror. It's owed to American banks, American pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and even the Federal Reserve itself. Americans pay taxes that fund the interest, which then flows right back into American retirement accounts. So, wild as it sounds, most of the debt America owes is actually owed to America.
And when we break down that remaining foreign slice, it debunks a massive public myth. Japan actually holds the most, with around $1 trillion. China, who is often cited as the big creditor, holds roughly $800 billion. That's actually just about 2% of the total U.S. debt. The rest is held by places like the UK, Luxembourg, and Belgium.
So, the crucial point to grasp here is that this system is entirely global. It's basically a planetary game of hot potato, except the potato is made of promises. Japan lends to the U.S. through treasuries. The U.S. lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing nations through the World Bank, and developing nations in turn lend back to advanced economies. It's like this massive poker table where every single player has borrowed chips from the person sitting right next to them.
And that leads us to this really profound realization. There is no such thing as debt-free money. You see, central banks don't just manage debt, they manufacture it. Every single time a central bank buys government bonds, it creates new money in exchange. Meaning every coin, every paper bill, every digital dollar in your bank account has an invisible IOU engraved on its surface. The liability of one balance sheet literally becomes the asset of another.
Which brings us right to the refinancing reality and the open secret of sovereign debt.
Okay, here is probably the biggest twist of this entire explainer. Unlike your personal credit card or your mortgage, governments do not plan to ever pay off their debt. Not now, not ever. They engage in refinancing. They treat it exactly like a rolling subscription. They just issue new bonds to pay off the old ones. Interest becomes the rent charged for stability. And that is actually by design, not by conspiracy or some kind of accident. The reason why is simply a matter of perspective. For you and me,
Personal debt is a liability that absolutely has to be repaid. But for sovereign debt, to investors, pension funds, and banks, a U.S. Treasury bond is the ultimate safe collateral. It is the very foundation of global financial markets. It's viewed as a critical asset, not a burden at all.
Which brings us to a truth that might completely surprise you. Paying off the national debt would destroy the very thing that makes the economy function. I know it sounds crazy, but imagine if Washington magically decided to pay down every last dollar of its debt tomorrow. Banks and funds around the world would suddenly lose their most stable asset. The global dollar supply would shrink dramatically, which would actually trigger severe deflation and global economic collapse. The debt is literally a kind of heartbeat for capitalism itself.
But we also have to look impartially at the mechanics of this system. Interest payments flow from everyday taxpayers and workers, and they flow upward to the institutions and wealthy investors who are holding the bonds. So the crucial takeaway here is that debt acts as an upward transfer of wealth. This directly explains why global inequality and global indebtedness tend to rise together. The system inherently rewards those who own the debt.
So let's move to a house of trust and the consequences of lost confidence.
Because this entire global engine relies entirely on a closed loop of trust. The world has to believe the debt will simply keep rolling over forever. There's a saying that perfectly captures this delicate balance. Democracy decides who governs, markets decide who survives. Behind every government bond sits a web of powerful institutions, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks, managing tens of trillions of dollars. They are the true arbiters of credit. If they ever lose confidence, the illusion ends abruptly.
And we've seen exactly what that looks like. Stark historical examples show us what happens when the engine runs out of fuel. In Greece back in 2010, unpayable debt led to harsh austerity and mass unemployment. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, a lack of foreign currency caused crippling fuel shortages and total political collapse. When the system breaks, those anonymous bondholders suddenly become very visible, and they demand actual repayment.
Okay, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. In a system where debt itself is money, what happens when a promise simply can't be kept forever? The plan was always to keep the world believing in the debt, to keep rolling it over seamlessly. But what happens to our reality if that trust finally breaks? It's something we all need to deeply consider as we watch the global balance sheet continue to grow. Thanks for joining me today. Keep learning and keep asking the big questions.